Imagine waking up tomorrow to find that the organization responsible for tracking hurricanes, monitoring climate change, and issuing life-saving weather warnings has vanished overnight. Sounds like the plot of a disaster movie, right? Well, a recent policy proposal has sent shockwaves through the meteorological community by suggesting just that. The dismantling of NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Today we're going off the radar and diving into the eye of this political storm. We'll decode the controversial Project 2025 document with a political scientist. Then we'll get insider perspective from Dr. Neil Jacobs, former NOAA administrator. Dr. Jacobs will discuss NOAA's interesting history.
So a lot of people don't realize that NOAA's existence has never been authorized by Congress. NOAA was created with an executive order.
What makes this organization so essential?
Like if the Weather Service went away, the entire weather enterprise would collapse.
And why he thinks NOAA is too solid for politics to shake.
Your mission is way too essential to the U.S. economy and the safety of all the citizens. So, you're not going anywhere.
I'm meteorologist Emily Gracie, and you're listening to Off the Radar, a production of the National Weather Desk. On the show, we dig deep into topics about weather, climate, the ocean, space, and much more. Our goal is to help you better understand the weather and to love it as much as we do. Welcome to Off the Radar. Today we're talking all about NOAA. For those of you who don't know, NOAA is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. One office that falls under NOAA that might be more recognizable to the general public is the National Weather Service. So they're responsible for so many things, including putting out watches and warnings. So when there's a tornado warning in your area and your phone goes nuts, that's the National Weather Service. They're putting that out. Even if you're using an app on your phone from a private company like a local TV station, that data is still coming from NOAA and the National Weather Service. So when a document called Project 2025 was released calling for the dismantling of NOAA, panic ensued in the weather community. So what exactly is Project 2025? Dr. Matt Nowlin is a professor of environmental policy at the College of Charleston in South Carolina.
So basically, it is kind of a blueprint or a map for what a future, the current thinking, of course, is a future Trump administration would look like, but really any more conservative type of presidential administration would look like. It essentially sort of lays out both plans for how to reform particular agencies, but also plans for hiring and recruiting personnel to appoint to those agencies that align with these goals, right? And broadly speaking, right, the goal is, as Trump advisor Steve Bannon said in 2015, 2016, that the goal of the Trump administration would be to dismantle the administrative state, right? And so scholars have long used the term administrative state in a specific way. And so it's kind of interesting to see that become kind of a political term.
Part of the document that we're focusing on today is all about NOAA, which falls under the Department of Commerce. The project called NOAA a colossal operation that has become one of the main drivers of the climate change alarm industry, and as such is harmful to future U.S. prosperity.
For dismantling it and streamlining NOAA, right? So taking some pieces of it, like the National Weather Service, and giving that over to private entities like AccuWeather, and then reducing some of the regulatory capacity of NOAA. In particular, there is language in there about climate change, as we might imagine, and climate alarmism, right, is the phrase that they use. And there's some critique of how NOAA presents data, with the argument being that NOAA is essentially kind of cooking the books, right, to make climate change seem worse than it actually is, right? Which, of course, is not the case. And so the aim then is to, as I see it, right, is to reduce the kind of information gathering and sharing capacity of NOAA, which then could downplay some of the effects that are happening as a result of climate change.
So today we're going to learn more about NOAA itself to see if, in fact, it can even be dismantled. Who better to tell us about that than someone who used to run it? Dr. Neil Jacobs was the NOAA administrator from 2019 to 2021 during the Trump administration. In this role, he was responsible for the strategic direction and oversight of $3.4 billion in annual spending, supporting NOAA's broad portfolio of sea, air, land, and space observing platforms, as well as the critical infrastructure for the assimilation and exploitation of environmental data. That's from the Department of Commerce's website. Dr. Jacobs, or Neil, is also just a really cool guy. He loves to surf and fish and run and be outside. He got his start working on boats and then went back to school and got his master's and PhD in meteorology from NC State. He's a scientist through and through, but also a wealth of knowledge on the science policy side. And he's an open book when it comes to sharing what he knows about the inside workings of the government. I learned so much from him today, and I hope you do too. My talk with him also gave me a lot more hope for the future of scientific research in America. Here's my talk with Dr. Neil Jacobs. Dr. Neil Jacobs, thrilled to have you on the podcast today. We have a lot of clearing up to do with the subject here. There's a lot of rumors going around on the social media and on the internet right now, a lot of articles coming out talking about NOAA and what could happen to NOAA in the coming months, coming years. Can you first of all give me a little background on yourself and how you got to this huge role as the administrator of NOAA?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on. This is an awesome opportunity. So my formal background and training is in numerical weather prediction. My undergraduate degrees are in math and physics, and it's kind of the interesting path on how I got to NOAA. Actually, is an interesting path on how I got to grad school. To be honest, my undergraduate degrees is more focused on like physics and applied math, and I financed my undergraduate on a debate scholarship. So there's kind of two parallel paths that'll make sense in a little bit. One is policy debate, and the other one was math and physics. And there's really not a lot you can do with an undergraduate degree in physics. So I had gone back to Charleston and was working as a fishing guide, wiring mostly shrimp boats, but charter boats and things like that, installing navigation systems and stuff. And the company that I was working with got a contract to do a lot of the wiring for scientific instrumentation on NOAA's Ron Brown, which is the ship that's ported down in Charleston. This is like 1995, maybe. And it was headed into the Indian Ocean for a big field experiment. One of the PIs who had instrument on the ship convinced me to go to NC State for grad school. And of course, why not? What else am I doing? And so that's how I ended up at NC State. Which is kind of funny because later on when I was back at NOAA, I went back to the Ron Brown, and it was pretty entertaining to tell him this wasn't actually the first time I've been on this ship. I actually wired a bunch of stuff here, but probably the mix of the policy debate stuff. This just sounds incredibly dorky, so bear with me. But I'm still involved in like high school and college policy debate, and a lot of those debaters in college ended up becoming congressional staffers. And because of the policy experience, I ended up doing a lot of work with Hill staff on legislation and policy and stuff like that. So it wasn't like I was a complete unknown to the DC area because of the collegiate policy debate world. And so that was kind of the angle that, one thing led to another, and I ended up getting called in to help with NOAA, and ended up becoming the acting administrator for the last 3 years there, including managing the agency during the pandemic, which was, can't possibly train for that. So it was exciting and amazing experience. I learned a lot, both about the agency and about DC in general. And yeah, just happy to share anything I've learned along the way.
Okay, so a lot of people, and I mean, I'm a meteorologist, but even for me, it's kind of hard to grasp a little bit the structure and leadership within NOAA and the different titles, because when you're NOAA administrator, you're also, the undersecretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmosphere. What's with all the titles? How can you give me a kind of a idiot's guide to the org chart here?
This is so my official title was the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Environmental Observation and Prediction, performing the non-exclusive duties of Undersecretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmospheres. And on my card, it was like my business card was like 3-point font in order to fit that on there. People are like, what, can we just call you like the acting administrator? It's weird. So let me back up for a second and just for folks that don't know, explain what the Department of Commerce angle is. So the National Weather Service has been around for a long time, over 150 years, but NOAA is relatively young. So NOAA was established in 1970. And the funny story is, and this actually ties back into some conversation we'll probably talk about later, there was this commissioned report that came out that said basically during the Nixon administration that you need to establish this Oceans and Atmospheres Agency in the Department of Interior to manage fisheries and weather and all this stuff. President Nixon was so irritated at Wally Hinkle, who was I think he was like pretty outspoken about opposing the Vietnam War, and was the Secretary of Interior. And so Nixon scratches out Interior and writes Commerce on the executive order. So a lot of people don't realize that NOAA's existence has never been authorized by Congress. NOAA was created with an executive order.
Out of spite. This sounds like.
The creation of NOAA of an executive order made a lot of sense, but sticking into the Department of Commerce was, probably out of spite. Because a lot of people are like, what is it doing in commerce? But when you think about like fisheries and things like that, there's a commerce angle to everything.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of people are like, why is NOAA in the Department of Commerce? Why isn't an independent agency like National Science Foundation or NASA or something like that? Well, those independent agencies have what they call is an organic act, which is a piece of legislation that authorizes their existence. NOAA's never had an organic act. So it's not like NOAA isn't authorized to exist. There's just no legislation authorizing it, but everything that NOAA does is authorized. But it makes it kind of a little bit of a quagmire, because anytime something in NOAA needs to be done with congressional mandate, there's a new authorization. And so there's hundreds of different pieces of legislations telling NOAA, you should do this for, endangered species or marine mammals or, launching satellites into space or deep ocean exploration. There's all this stuff that NOAA does. And you would have, there's probably, a couple hundred pieces of legislation with all these different mandates. And so that the reason why I'm explaining this is NOAA, a lot of people understand, particularly in the meteorology world, that the Weather Service is in NOAA. The Hurricane Center is probably, what a lot of people hear about, that's in the Weather Service, or INSEP's in the Weather Service. But a lot of people don't realize NOAA's in the Department of Commerce. I think a lot of people also don't realize that the Weather Service is just one line office in NOAA. So there's other line offices. There's the research line office, OAR. Then there's fisheries. There's NESDIS, which does all the satellites. There's OMAO, which, they're the ones who do the hurricane hunters and the ships. And so, they have a uniformed officer corps. It's pretty diverse agency. Like I used to joke with people that, if you really want to understand everything NOAA does, you need like a PhD in 12 different disciplines. But the organizational structure is a little bit strange, because each head of the line office is what they call an assistant administrator. So you've got the National Ocean Service, for example. So the assistant administrator of the National Ocean Service, you've got the assistant administrator of the Weather Service. And then next up above them are the political appointees. So the AAs are your highest senior level career folks. They're what they call Senior Executive Service, SES. And then above them are the political appointees, and you have two assistant secretaries. One is over, that was my former title. It's observations and prediction. The other one is oceans and atmospheres, which kind of manages more in the fisheries world. And then you have the Undersecretary of Commerce, who is also the NOAA administrator.
And are all of those roles appointed by the president? And if so, do they change with every administration?
Yeah. So the above the SES, what they call the EX positions, those are all presidential appointees. Now, not all of them are Senate confirmed. So the undersecretary position and the 2 assistant secretary positions require Senate confirmation.
Okay. So I understand a little bit better now, but it's still very confusing. Can you tell me about your role you were talking about NASA having an Organic Act. You have tried in the past, right, to push forward an Organic Act for NOAA. How did that go, and where does it stand now?
So it's been introduced. So Chairman Lucas in the House Science Committee introduced an Organic Act for NOAA this year. It's not been the first time. This is, I think, the 4th or 5th time over the last probably 20 years that an Organic Act has been introduced. There's pretty much bipartisan support for an Organic Act. There's not a lot of opposition on either side of the aisle for NOAA to have an Organic Act. I think where the sticking point is do you pull NOAA out of the Department of Commerce, or do you leave them in the Department of Commerce?
Is that thunder?
Yeah. Is that...
No, it was it was also very timely. It was like, yeah. It was very Count Dracula. So, what are the pros and cons? What's the pro here
So, I mean, the pros would be, as NOAA as an independent agency, they get to make all their decisions. Like when I was doing NOAA's budget and trying to come up with a lot of initiatives and priorities and policies, I had to go through the Department of Commerce. Like if the Department of Commerce's priorities might not necessarily be aligned with mine because they've got to worry about economic development and census and like all this other stuff. And so depending on what their priorities are, I didn't necessarily have like a complete blank slate to do my budget and policy. And so that's a little bit tricky because there's an extra layer of bureaucracy that NOAA's kind of stuck underneath. And having an independent agency like NASA and NSF where they can just say, okay, this is what we're going to do, and we have our own budget, and this is how we're going to do it, and that's it. We don't have to get approval from, any, above us except for maybe OMB. That has a lot of appeal. But the downside is the Department of Commerce, the Secretary of Commerce is a cabinet position. And the cabinet positions are very, very powerful. And so the Secretary of Commerce would certainly outrank the NASA administrator, for example. So if I ever had an issue that I needed to elevate because I needed support on it, I would get the Secretary of Commerce to advocate for me, which had a lot more clout than if I was just an independent NOAA and here's the NOAA administrator saying, I'm worried about this. And everyone's like, we don't care. But if a secretary says I'm worried about this, then wow, it's a big deal. Yeah. So, probably the other argument would be that you would have to add a lot of money to NOAA's budget to pull this off, because there's a lot of things that the Department of Commerce does, and you can argue whether they're doing a good job or not. But like things like payroll and retirement and hiring and all the kind of like the HR stuff, and that, like, there's a lot of enterprise services across the entire Department of Commerce that NOAA gets to take advantage of that are in DOC's budget. Whereas if NOAA was an independent agency, they would have to do all that themselves. It doesn't mean they can't. I'm sure those people exist, but they would need a huge plus up in their budget to build out that capability, which right now they're using Department of Commerce for.
What about if NOAA were independent, would the head of NOAA be appointed, or how would that position be decided?
Yeah, it would be the same. Like the NASA administrator is a presidential nominee who needs Senate confirmation. Same for the National Science Foundation. So all that process would be the same. I think like all things equal, and if the budget was there, I think an independent NOAA would be amazing. But, there are pros and cons, and that's why it's still being debated.
Okay. Let's talk about this fun subject of Project 2025. This document came out. I'm really curious about your opinion being in this role 4 years ago or however long it was, because there's a lot of misinformation. Just from talking to you leading up to this podcast, it seems like there's a lot of misinformation about this document. And I think there's some alarming wording too, like dismantling NOAA. And you immediately told me, like, that's not happening. So can you tell me why that's not happening?
Well, I guess people need to know that any time there's an administration or an election year, whether it's an incumbent or a new administration, whether the incumbent wins or the party changes hands, you're always going to have these think tanks and groups pushing policy documents to the transition team saying, this is what you should do. You should read this. And I don't really know a whole lot about the Project 2025 besides what I've read on, the news, but the talk of sort of moving NOAA around or breaking it up that's been talked about for years. That's one of the reasons why a lot of people want NOAA to have an organic act. But one of the reasons why this is going to be almost impossible to implement is because NOAA doesn't have an organic act, which is ironic. And it's not the first time. So this was proposed when I was there. In fact, before I was there, during the Obama administration, they wanted to break up NOAA and move fisheries into Interior, which ironically enough was where it was originally planned to be before it ended up in Commerce. The reason why I think that this is going to be next to impossible is because the executive branch can't just come in and completely change something that is authorized in law. Like they can't just move something or get rid of it, because NOAA has all these congressional mandates that are codified. So there's, like I was saying earlier, there's probably 200 different bills which tell NOAA they've got these different mission requirements, whether it's like Marine Mammal Protection Act or endangered species or weather forecasting or like all sorts of stuff that's tied to that. Like for example, the Weather Act in 2017, and now you have the Weather Act reauthorization, which just passed the House, which gives NOAA all these different mandates of things to do. Like you can't just stop doing that without Congress's approval. And so I think this idea that you would have like someone in the White House that would say, we're just going to get rid of this, you would need a congressional approval. Like Congress would have to rewrite a mountain of legislation to undo all that. I don't know how realistic that is, especially since they've spent the last 2 years working on the Weather Act reauthorization, which was introduced by Chairman Lucas in the House Science Committee. It passed the entire House. It was voted out of committee unanimously and passed the entire House with, I think, just maybe 300 and something to 10. So the bipartisan support is astronomical for this stuff. And so I think that there's a tremendous amount of support in Congress for what NOAA does. And, the other thing to think about is there's kind of I guess for people who observe what the Weather Service does from outside the meteorology community, they may think, why would we need the Weather Service when we can go to some, .com or whatever and get our weather information? And everyone knows those industries are getting all their information from the Weather Service. Like if the Weather Service went away, the entire weather enterprise would collapse. And one thing I like to tell people is if you look in the terms of percentages, the weather enterprise is quite possibly the most heavily subsidized industry in the country, because I did sort of a back of the envelope calculation a couple of years ago. And on average, and this is super rough estimate, for every 1% improvement in forecast skill, that NOAA's spending a couple $1 billion. because if you think about it, they're launching satellites into space, like JPSS and GOES. Those aren't cheap. Those are like $10 billion programs. The processing of the data, the high performance computing, all that stuff is hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. And then basically everything after that is free. Now, it's not technically free. Everything costs something. It's paid for by the taxpayers, but all that computer model output's free. All that radar data is free. All that satellite data is free to the end user. And so you can stand up a business with all this free data and charge, $15 a year for access to an app. If you had to pay for all that yourself, you would have to charge like $15,000 a year, maybe $15,000 a month. Can you imagine? It's like, I don't think the consumer market would be okay with that. And so it's kind of funny for a lot of people who don't actually understand how these products and services in private industry are created on the back of a massive undertaking that NOAA and the Weather Service do.
And, in reading some of these articles, it seems like the thought process is, keep the satellites, keep the data coming in, keep the observations, but the forecast portion of it, they are trying to privatize a little bit more. So I think the fear is, are tornado warnings going to be something you suddenly have to pay for?
This is one reason why there's been some debate, and it's kind of funny because and I spent a large portion of my career in private industry, I don't think private industry would want to take on that legal liability.
Yeah, good point.
It's like
good point.
You can issue a forecast to improve operations or something, but if your job is to protect people's lives and they die, you're going to get sued. And so I think a lot of companies have looked at that and said, we don't want to go there. Redistributing watches and warnings, like this is another thing that I think is kind of interesting. Going back to the fair weather report, and if this airs before the AMS summer community meeting, we're going to be discussing at the summer community meeting about sort of revisiting the fair weather report. So that was done in 2003. And it was basically, where are the swim lanes between the public sector and the private sector? Yeah, who does what? And that this obviously changing because the private sector's capabilities growing. They're not just necessarily repackaging output, but they're also producing data on the front end. They're producing a lot more observations that go into the models. There's a pretty amazing public-private academic partnership in the weather enterprise. So I know it's the interesting story in the news is like, it's public versus private, but the reality is it's one of the best public-private partnerships I've ever seen. Like when you go to the Weather Service Friends and Partners meetings, like everyone's on the same team. And so that's it's pretty interesting to me to see that dynamic. I've had people come to me from like other markets and other industries, and they're like, how did the weather enterprise figure out this public-private who does what relationship? Because it actually seems really, really functional. But there's private industries that have apps that are transmitting weather service watches and warnings. And that would, Weather Service looks at private industry as a force multiplier to help get their products out there. And so I think that there's a lot of win-wins there with private industry, where if you actually tried to let one or the other do it, it would not be nearly as good as the sum of both of them.
Yeah, and not just with forecasting. I mean, I know AccuWeather is kind of like the poster child for private, and that's the one that gets all the attention. But there's all these little like observational things going on, especially right now with hurricanes, like the people that are making the drones, like Black Swift, making the drones, all these little, companies that have the ability to create these observational resources that maybe most of the public doesn't understand or know is happening and is working in tandem with the government.
Yeah. I mean, there's like the National Mesonet program is one of my favorite programs because they pull in all this different data that a lot of people probably don't even realize exist or they don't know where it comes from. And so it's awesome. And it used to be that, you just have like these surface stations or whatever. But now there's all sorts of cool data that's being pulled in. Like you've got commercial satellite data from like GPS radio occultations. You've got commercial aircraft data, which was a program that I worked on. You've got kind of the Internet of Things. Like, for example, you could pull accelerometer data off your smartphone if you're in a commercial flight and download that data, or you could Bluetooth your phone to your car and it could tell you when the windshield wipers are on. So maybe you got a proxy observation for rainfall or something like that. There's all these different cool ways that you can aggregate this data and use it. And so, I think it's pretty cool to see the private sector actually putting their data in there. And then, NOAA has got what they call this data dissemination. It's with like Google, the different cloud service providers, where they're making all this stuff available. So you can go on to like Amazon or Azure or Google and get all of this information, the radar data, satellite data, model output.
AI, the Google DeepMind AI stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there's the INSEP right now is really taking a hard look at AI, and it's this is probably a whole nother podcast you could do on AI.
We've done a couple.
I'm of the camp that like I don't think AI is replacing physics-based models, but I do think that AI might replace the cycled prediction systems, whereas the physics-based models are just generating the training data sets. And then you run AI for your day in and day out forecast. But there's no getting around having to observe the atmosphere and do like a physics-based model. But the idea that you might have to cycle it every hour in real time, if AI can replicate that process, it's a game changer as far as, compute resources.
I want to ask you about NOAA and climate research, because that's a lot of what's fueling this document too, is this idea that climate research within NOAA is creating alarmism and that needs to be shut down. Can you address that at all?
The research is what it is. The beauty of where I think NOAA sits in the process is if all they do is research and they just produce results, they produce data, they make all that publicly available. So the models, the data, it's all available. They're not really there. It's not like NOAA's making policy decisions on that stuff. That's for the policymakers. And that's where I think a lot of people look at it as, you got to balance all these priorities with like energy and population and, health and climate. NOAA just contributes the data. And so, they're in a pretty solid ground if they just stay, we're the objective, honest broker with the data. Here it is. My biggest concern for them is that when you put all this data out on a server, you do kind of expose yourself to people not understanding how to interpret it. Mm-hmm. And you can get, you could have people download the data and they're it's not like it's nefarious. They honestly think they're interpreting it the right way, but maybe they're not. And they come to the wrong conclusions. Like, a good example is like sea level rise. Like I remember looking at the data set for sea level rise and the projections were, if you just looked at the raw data, it was like 1 foot to 30 feet or something. And people like, they don't know what they're talking about. It could be nothing. It could be catastrophic. But what they didn't understand was there's actually a confidence interval around that data. And so you're really in the middle somewhere with like what you think is like your 95% confidence interval. And so you just kind of ignore the tails in the distribution. But if you didn't know what the distribution looked like and you just looked at like what is the highest value and the lowest value, you would come to a wildly different conclusion. And so, I think when you put all that data out there, and I think putting all the data out there is the right thing to do, but I think there needs to be a focus on the metadata and the interpretation of it so that you don't have a situation where someone who probably has good intentions and they think they understand what they're doing, but they download the data and they misinterpret it, or they leave something out and they end up accidentally coming to the wrong conclusion. Mm. And then you're having to clean up that mess and then say, you got the right data, but you interpreted it the wrong way. And then they're like, once this gets out on the internet, the story takes on a life of its own and you're never going to, run it down at that point. So you really got to get out in front of it, which, You would think it seems easy, but it's not.
Yeah, I get it. I mean, when you go to like get a radiology report done and they, you know that they have the results, but they won't tell them to you. They're going to make you wait until the doctor calls you.
Exactly.
It's the same sort of thing. I'm curious too, in your role as NOAA administrator, you're a weather guy, you know, master's, PhD, atmospheric science, right? Has someone in that role always been weather focused, or what kind of people wind up in that role? And were you like the first meteorologist to really take that on?
No, I think I might have been the second one. I want to say, I could be wrong about this, but I want to say Bob White, the first, was a meteorologist. But no, I Dr. Spinrad is an oceanographer. I believe Kathy Sullivan was a geologist. The areas of expertise are all over the place, which is interesting. And I think it's good for NOAA too, because NOAA is such a diverse agency with you know, such varying mission requirements. It's interesting in the sense that it brings a lot of like diversity of thought to the science and the policy, but it's probably, I can imagine as a career employee, it might be a little bit frustrating because like every 4 or 8 years you have new leadership come in with new focus area. And they're like, oh, well, we were doing this, but now the focus is that the new priority is like whales. Oh, wait, no, now it's ocean exploration, or, you know, oh, no, it's space weather.
Yeah, space weather. I think that's another one people don't realize is under NOAA.
No, yeah, it's like the Space Weather Prediction Center out in Boulder. It's one of NCEP's centers. And, you know, there's a lot of people used to say, oh, you know, what keeps you up at night? Are you worried about another Katrina? And honestly, the thing that had me the most freaked out was like a poorly forecasted coronal mass ejection that like takes out the power grid in the U.S.
Yeah. I did a whole podcast episode on the Carrington event.
Yeah, that's scary.
And it is. Yeah.
There's nothing you can do about it except preemptively shut things down and hope for the best.
Yeah, it's scary how much we rely on the grid. So yeah, throw some money in that direction. Let's get those forecasts a little better. Okay, so I know you're heavily involved in AMS, or at least have been in the past. Forecast Improvement Group, which is funny. I wrote down FIG, and I was making a list today of like restaurant recommendations in Charleston.
Oh,
and then
it's one of my favorites.
For you. And then FIG was on both lists. So
nice. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so Forecast Improvement Group, can you kind of tell me like who's on that board and what the goal is?
The goal is kind of, well, it sounds like really vague, like with the Forecast Improvement Group. Like you know, obviously you want to improve the forecast. I think the idea was just, it came out of frustration, like I don't know, 5-6 years ago, maybe. And it was, you know, how do we get everyone, not just the users of the forecast? Because when you look at like people in AMS, a lot of them are stakeholders or users, but who are the creators? The software engineers, the people who are writing a lot of the model code, and how can we work with them to actually improve the forecast? And so that was kind of my top priority when I went to NOAA. Was everyone was just like, why is the European Center beating the GFS and anomaly correlation scores? Like, this is outrageous. You know, the American model should be the best. And so my focus was, you know, how do we improve this? And I'm kind of like back up and tell a little story here about how we got into this problem in the first place. For years, the GFS, and I'll just use the GFS as an example, was hard-coded towards NOAA's on-prem high-performance computing, which was IBM. And IBM had this operating system, AIX. So all their code was written specifically for that hardware. So while the code was freely available to the taxpayer, you couldn't run it on anything unless you went out and bought like a $50 million IBM supercomputer. And so the problem that NOAA ran into was they had all these universities with all these PhDs with all these great ideas who are like, we know how to fix the model, we can improve it. Give us the code and we'll improve the model. And so the Weather Service is like, here you go, here's the code. And they're like, but we can't run it. And they're like, oh, well, you got to go buy a $50 million supercomputer that's just like ours because we hard coded all the software to run on just our architecture. And so then those universities were like, well, that's not going to work. Can we log in and just do it on yours? And they're like, not without a security clearance. And so then they had inadvertently boxed themselves out of access to all this academic expertise because of the way that they had written all their software and, the rules around national security. And so what we did when we were basically did a wholesale refactoring of a lot of the code into what's known now as the Unified Forecast System. And this all started before I got to NOAA. So it was kind of interesting that I ended up at NOAA to kind of implement my own plan. While we're going to refactor all this code, we might as well make it hardware agnostic. So you can run it on Linux, you can run it on I've run the GFS on my MacBook Pro. It's hardware agnostic now. And so essentially what the plan was to take all this code, make it hardware agnostic, stick it out on GitHub, do all of your development work in public facing repositories, and then invite the academic community in to say, hey, we're doing all our development work in these public facing GitHub repositories. You can run this on your laptops. You can run it in Amazon Cloud. You can run it wherever. Go play with it, optimize it. If you come up with something cool, come back and tell us about it. The strategy was to crowdsource model development, which we've done. The GFS is out there and there's a lot of universities that are playing around with it. We haven't started seeing improvements with it, but
so
step one is to just, we didn't expect to see improvements right away because they're still learning it.
Yeah.
But I think it's only been out there and it's like the second version that's been released. So I would expect over the next few years to start seeing people sharing improvements and optimizations back. And I think that's going to be a game changer as far as accelerating the development program, because instead of having, 5 or 10 software engineers or scientists looking at the code, you've got, 500 or 1,000.
Okay, I want to go back to some of the Project 2025 stuff. For the common person who doesn't really know how NOAA affects their life or the importance of NOAA, can you tell me some of the surprising things that NOAA does that the common American may not know about?
Obviously your weather forecasts, all that stuff, pretty much a lot of people know about. But, I guess going from maybe the more common to the less common, NOAA's the one flying the planes into the hurricanes. If you ever get a chance to fly in one of the hurricane hunters, that's always a wild ride.
I want to do that.
They launch rockets. I was just down at Cape Canaveral a few weeks ago for the GOES launch on a SpaceX rocket. That was pretty awesome. So launching rockets into outer space is super cool. They do ROV exploration of the deep ocean. So this is another amazing source of entertainment for me, is just to go on the live stream from the Oceanic Explorer, one of NOAA's ships. And they basically have like these high definition cameras and they broadcast live, and they just take this thing and they film life forms on the bottom. And it's wild because they'll constantly come across like new kinds of life forms. And what's funny is it's being watched by these marine biologists who are kind of narrating it in real time. And you can hear their surprise. They're like, holy cow, what is that? That might be like a new species, and they literally are like discovering new species like on an hourly basis. It's the craziest thing.
Wow.
And then there's the fisheries side. So I don't think a lot of people realize like the fisheries, and then you've got you've got the marine sanctuaries. So up in the DC area, we've got Mallows Bay. Down in the Keys, that's there's a lot of marine sanctuaries that's managed by NOAA. But the fisheries, to me, because I come from a recreational fishing background, that's always been interesting because they manage all the offshore and inshore species. So this goes back to a little bit of, hey, why isn't the fisheries in the Department of Interior when Fish and Wildlife Service is in Interior? And so for things like trout, Fish and Wildlife Service manage trout. Well, something like tuna or red snapper, NOAA manages that. But where things get weird is like salmon. Because salmon are in the ocean except when they spawn, and then they swim upstream. And because NOAA normally manages salmon, when salmon swim inland, you have NOAA telling Department of Interior how to manage the flow rates of their dams to keep the water flow right, because some of these fish, like the Delta smelt, are protected species. Then it's like, well, you can't tell my department what to do.
Oh.
NOAA's like, well, it's the law. It's the Endangered Species Act. Like, we don't have a choice. And so that's kind of where it's like, where it gets really weird as to where's the handoff point. Is it location based? Is it species based? But when people are thinking about what's the catch limit, like for something like redfish, which is usually what I'm fishing for in the Carolinas, there is a catch limit, and there's also sizes. So you can keep them, they got to be above a size, below a size. There's what they call slot redfish. So all that stuff is set by the fisheries, and they're monitoring populations, both on the recreational fishing and on the commercial fishing side. Because if you overfish, you basically run the species into the ground, and it ends up hurting the fisheries. So proper management of the fisheries is a huge deal. On the commercial side, a lot of people might not know that NOAA has their own law enforcement agency. So
I don't think I knew that.
It was funny. I was doing an interview once with Al Roker, and I was telling him about like the NOAA has, and he's like, fish police. That's pretty awesome. But it's true. They have
slightly nerdy, but yeah. They have their own law enforcement agency for illegal and unregulated fishing. So believe it or not, there's a lot of illegal poaching in the commercial fishing industry. And NOAA regulates that if it's within our exclusive economic zone. I'm curious, and you are well entwined with the NOAA community. I'm sure that you're getting a lot of questions about this. What would you tell NOAA employees or people that are even managing budgets within NOAA right now who are kind of freaking out?
My grandma used to tell me, "Don't borrow trouble." I wouldn't worry about it. Your mission is way too essential to the U.S. economy and the safety of all the citizens. So you're not going anywhere. Not to mention all these constituents that you serve also happen to be voters of members in Congress. You're going to have bipartisan support from Congress. It's always going to be tricky when budgets get tight and inflation goes up, and every administration, regardless of whether it's Republican or Democrat, is going to have to make tough budget choices, and that's just kind of how it works. I wish there was enough money to fund every cool idea I heard at NOAA, but there never is, and there never will be. But if you look at sort of the presidential budget requests versus what Congress enacts, it's always like you have some administrations that come in with these just ridiculously high requests, and then some that come in with like a ridiculously low request. But then if you actually look at what Congress enacts, which is the real budget, it's steady. We've got a balance of powers for a reason.
Right. But don't the people who wrote this document know that?
I see documents proposing to do all sorts of stuff that from an implementation perspective is like, I don't know, even if I thought it was a great idea, I still don't know how you pull it off. I think a lot of these sort of vision documents need to be just looked at as vision documents. Like this is not like an implementation plan. This is kind of like a high level vision of, what it could be like, something to think about. And so it's always like you've got these visions way over here on one side, you may have visions way on the other side. Reality of what you can actually pull off is probably in the middle.
And, you keep saying bipartisan. I think a lot of people don't feel that way when it comes to views of NOAA. And especially given the fact that it's NOAA administrators, this appointed position. So can you tell me how the dynamic is there of NOAA being non-partisan?
I mean, every agency political as run by political appointees. So like National Science Foundation is run by a political appointee. So is NASA. So there's always going to be an element of partisan politics at the top. But I think that the careers a layer below that, at least in my experience, did a really good job of they're like, look, we work for NOAA, we work for the American people. We realize we're an executive branch agency, but we're serving the public. And so that's they kind of view it as not that they're working for one party or another, but that they work for the people that they serve. And, when it comes to science agencies, I really feel like it's helpful for the political appointees to have a PhD in some science field related to what the agency does. But it's like I was saying, like NOAA's mission's so diverse. Like if I had a PhD in marine biology, I would be just as much qualified as someone with a PhD in solar heliophysics or something. But I think it's the important thing is that not that they understand or have a PhD level of knowledge in that field, but that they've been around the science community. They understand how research works. They've written papers. But I also think it's really helpful to have experience in running a business, in doing HR management. Like a lot of times, if you pull in someone to run an agency and they come from like a pure academic background, they might not understand like how to manage budgets or how to deal with HR stuff. I mean, I don't think I was prepared when I first got in there, and I've worked my entire career in all three sectors. And it's, if you want to come in and just go to like black tie events and shake hands, that's great. But if you want to come in and really have a positive impact, you got to be willing to listen to a lot of the careers, because they're the continuity between administrations. Because you got to think about it. If you're a top level, senior career person at NOAA who's been there through multiple administrations, you're actually, in a perfect world, you're helping your leadership, because you should know more about how the process inside the agency works than they do, because you've been there for 30 years and they've been there for 3 months.
All right. Well, Neil, what are you up to now? Anything you want to share about, your life now and what you're doing? You still getting outdoors and enjoying some time outside?
I am. I mean, working at NOAA meant I really couldn't surf and fish as much as I wanted to. So I've spent a ton of time surfing and fishing. Haven't missed a decent swell in a while, and I spent about a month and a half down in the Everglades in Miami doing a lot of fishing for snook and tarpon and stuff down there, and then the rest of the time just doing a lot of red fishing in the Charleston Low Country area. And other than that, focused on the UFS.
Awesome. Is there anything else you want to share about NOAA or what you're working on now? Or
well, yeah, I did. For people out there who are interested in policy, I would suggest taking a look at the AMS policy program. The AMS puts on this thing every summer called the Policy Colloquium, which I've been involved with for the last few years. And I give 3 different lectures there, one on policy debate, one on budget formulation, and then just one on like wild and crazy stories about DC deal making.
Who can participate in that? I've always wondered that.
Anybody.
Really? So it's not just for students, it's for anybody.
Anybody. Yep. We have senior career level people at NOAA and NASA.
I used to work in that I used to work with Bill Hook. I worked for AMS when I first graduated college. So I worked in that office. It was just full of very important people. It was awesome.
Bill is the man. He's such an inspiration.
He's so kind.
I know. It's every time I'm done having a conversation with him, I feel like I can do anything. It's amazing. I know.
He's like the ultimate hype man.
Yeah. It's like if I ever am doubting myself, I just need to go talk to him.
I know.
It's a really cool program. Like we'll bring in congressional staffers, people from the agency, like Ken Graham came and spoke, and you get to talk to some different senators and representatives and people from OMB at the White House and OSTP. And they basically just tell you, how it really is. And it's always an eye opener to people because, it's always fun for me because people come into the colloquium and they think that like DC is like this just hellhole of insanity. And like everyone hates each other. And when they you'll have like a panel of both Republican and Democrat staffers and realize that they're all friends and they're working together. The people are like, wow, maybe this is functioning better than we thought it was.
I feel like the general public needs to see more of that.
They do.
Thank you so much for giving me this amount of time, for giving everybody who's listening this amount of time, because it's been so important to understand what's going on right now in the world and specifically with NOAA. So I really appreciate you taking the time.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. It was great talking to you, and be fun to catch up down in Charleston sometime.
Yeah. Off the Radar is a production of the National Weather Desk. Make sure you're following the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. New episodes published every Tuesday. We'd also love you to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Thank you so much to Dr. Neil Jacobs for taking the time to share this important information today. Also, a huge thanks to Dr. Matt Nowlin for joining me at the beginning of the episode. For the National Weather Desk, I'm meteorologist Emily Gracie. Make it a great day.